Hi, I'm Dwight. Welcome to the subject. Today I want to give you kind of an overview, an introduction, if you will, of what we're going to be talking about here. I've designed this subject basically as an exercise in what we would call political economy, which is the study of how a country is managed or governed, taking into account both political and economic factors. That is, why do we do business in Australia like Australians do? Why do the Japanese do business differently? Why do the Chinese, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the French, the Germans, the Norwegians, why do they do business in their own particular fashion? Why isn't there just one way of doing business? Well, we're going to have to go back in history to really understand this. And for some of you, you're going to be going, oh my God, we have to catch up on about 1,000 years here. Well, could be worse. I could take you back farther than that, but we're really not going to take you back more than a little while. We could start, with the Sumerians. The Sumerians, what were they called? The Erlenmeyer tablets. Gave a picture of Sumerian production in the Euphrates Valley around 2200 to 21 BC. We could start with the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BC and the Silk Road, which brought both trade and development to large parts of the Asian world all the way up through the Middle East and ending in Istanbul, which is the very door of Europe. The 1358 establishment in Lubeck of the Hanseatic League. The Hansa were large trading houses that became powerful enough to pretty much set the terms of trade. In the Baltic and the North Seas, they promulgated trade, they promulgated rules for trade, and they even were known to hire private armies to enforce the rules for trade. So at such point in time, they were the system of global trade in Europe. And history sometimes comes back, which we'll get to. In 1776, we could start. A Scottish moral philosopher, is what they were called at the time, by the name of Adam Smith, wrote his seminal work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. The wealth of nations is pretty much seen as the foundation for all of modern economics, and I don't think anybody has any serious arguments with that. This book is up there on a level with Darwin's, On the Origin of Species, Aristotle's, Nature of Principia Mathematica. Excuse me, Newton's Principia Mathematica, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. These books redefined pretty much how we live, how we think about the world around us. Smith wasn't just writing some philosophical tone for being a philosopher. He was also writing in response to common practice at the time. There were two basic theories of economics. One of them is mercantilism. Mercantilism held that what the state should do is manage trade to the point of passing laws for all kinds of manufacturers and trades in order to enrich the state and make it more powerful. That's what Britain was doing with her colonies, for example, using them as providers of natural resources for the factories back in the home country. That was a general way to keep the outer periphery poor and immutable. But so Smith wasn't a really big fan of that, being a Scotsman. And secondly, there was the idea of the physiocracy, or the Physiocrats. The Physiocrats pretty much believed that the only real form of wealth was land and therefore agriculture. And what we should do then is to, being that it's derived solely from agriculture, we should figure out ways to support that value. I think you'll find some of these folks still in the National Party here with probably the leading thinker for them was a French economist by the name of Quinet. Around 1778 we can start, couldn't we? James Watt at that time had developed the steam engine, and that's pretty much where the Industrial Revolution kicked off. The Industrial Revolution is generally seen, or the first one as it's sometimes called, by economic historians, kick off around 1828, ran until 1860 or thereabouts. But those dates are just really vague. Nobody can assign a specific date. But if we start with James Watt's steam engine, steam is what allowed us to go away from actual horsepower, using horses, to hundreds of horsepower, and just by boiling water. I mean, it's pretty much an incredible step forward in productivity. And we're still involved in the Industrial Revolution now, I would argue. Why are small towns in Australia still dying out? Well, because you only need a couple of people to run a large station nowadays. You don't need, you know, a couple of hundred ringers or, you know, or a bunch of itinerant sheep shearers moving around. Automated cutting shears have dramatically cut the need for shearers. Industrial Revolution stuff happening, you know, even to this day. How about the age of the clipper ship? Sometimes, you know, great steps forward in transportation will herald a new phase in industrial development. The steamships, of course, but the clipper ships themselves, around 1845. Some American shipwrights built a ship called the Rainbow, which is seen as the first true clipper ship. Dramatically cut transportation times to the point where it did a run from China to New York in 88 days, which was at that time was pretty incredible. In fact, clipper ships still hold the speed record. The Flying Cloud set the world's record for the fastest passage between New York and San Francisco, 89 days, 8 hours. She held that record for over 100 years, from 1854 to 1989. A clipper ship was capable of doing on average about 16 knots, about 400 miles a day, which is pretty damn impressive in anybody's book. But being that they were built very narrow, it was called clipper because it clipped the waves, but it speeded up transportation of very valuable goods. It was used for the tea, the opium runs, moving silks and gold and silver. Should we start there? Well, I don't know. The first era of globalization began with the clipper ships largely, and, you know, and later the steamships, which came around the middle of the 1800s, and ended pretty much with with World War I, because at that time, the first era of globalization, we had global trade agreements, although it was largely through, you know, royal patents, you know, the Dutch East India Company, those kinds of things. And at that time, trade wasn't very democratic. And it is, average people like you and I didn't really participate in the global movement very much unless we were immigrants, to such an extent that, you know, it was the bankers, you know, the Rothschilds, the Mellons, who really got rich from that era of globalization. That all came to a crash with World War I because those agreements on trade went out the window. Everybody closed back in on themselves, which kind of led us into the Great Depression in 1929. But there was also some movements in economics as well that we're going to need to talk about. John Maynard Keynes wrote a book in 1936 called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which for a long time was seen as the Bible of economic theory. And there are some who still believe it's the Bible today. I disagree, but that's something we'll talk about later in the semester. But Keynes completely reformed the way we thought about economies. But remember, part of his experience was going through the war, and at that time we had war boards that were managing economies in Europe. Well, pretty much all over the world. And we did that again in World War II, where we had rationing, you know, and production boards, industry boards of various sorts, rubber drives, iron drives, scrap metal drives, that kind of thing. And the argument is that, well, if we were able to manage our way through the two great wars, shouldn't we be able to manage ourselves through the peace? And that was very persuasive, particularly, you know, in Keynes' home of the United Kingdom. But there was a sometime friend, sometime colleague of Keynes, Friedrich von Hayek. Hayek was from the Austrian School of Economics, which we will again talk about later. There are many schools. The two main ones you'd argue about today would be the Keynesians, the Austrians. Of course, the Chicago School, we can't forget about them. More Nobel Prizes than pretty much any group of human beings on the planet at the University of Chicago. Hayek wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom in 1944. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek was very concerned about the rise of both fascism and socialism, because he saw them as two sides of the same coin, more or less, in that they led to, and he put a very sinister tone on it, the planners. The planners, once they started planning industry, had to start planning everything else, to match. So they had to plan society. Very influential book, The Road to Serfdom, particularly among libertarian types. At one time, General Motors paid to have it produced as a comic book. If you ask me, I'll show that to you in class. It's quite fascinating. But, the strange thing is we've been having that same argument now ever since these two books came out, pretty much since 1944. Also in 1944, the 1st of July, 1944, 730 delegates from all 44 Allied nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Why should you care about a small town in New Hampshire? Well, that conference, which lasted for about a month, led to the formation of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the IBRD, which is the International Bank for Reconstruction Development, which rebuilt Europe, and later became the World Bank. They created an adjustably pegged foreign exchange rate system, and all currencies were mandated to be convertible. That is, if I've got francs, I should be able to turn them into Deutschmarks, and vice versa. And that system, I mean, you can still see we still have the IMF, we still have the World Bank. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, came out of that, and then became the WTO, which was one of the original proposals in 1944, but didn't really eventuate till what? WTO, I think, was formed in 1977. I'll have to look that up. So that system is still with us, but how is it still as important as it was at the time? And the fact of the matter is, in 1971, on August 15th, Richard Nixon unilaterally pulled the U.S. out of the Bretton Woods Accord, thereby making it null and void. He also took us off the gold standard, took the U.S. off the gold standard, which took pretty much everybody else off the gold standard, because at that time the United States was still, a major portion, well, it still is, a major portion of the global economy. So what happened after 44? Well, things pretty much went along swimmingly for a long time. That Keynesian, the Keynesian prescription was working till about 1973. The 73 oil shock pretty much put paid to it. Why? Well, in 1944, Friedrich von Hayek predicted that Keynesianism would come unraveled because of inflation. And for those of you that were alive back in 73, inflation is what we got. Big mountains of inflation, 18, 20% interest rates, to try to squeeze it out of the economy. And that bankrupted a lot of small people, a lot of small investors. And the remnants of that are still with us today. Because the 1979 oil crisis, the energy crisis, which came along thereafter, brought about the 1980 recession, which was largely the end of the Keynesian economics killed by inflation. Also led to some interesting points in history. Maggie Thatcher on, May 4th, 1979, became Prime Minister of the UK. And after the Falklands War, she was able to enact all her economic reforms. January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States. He was an acolyte of Hayek, if you will. He studied economics at university. Of course, that was many years ago. But he knew what these theories were and decided to enact them just as Thatcher did. A couple of other significant things came out during that period of time. 7th of September, 1980. Solidarity was founded in Gdansk, Poland. Solidarity was finally, I think it was the straw that broke the camel's back of communism in the East. And talk about history coming back. Danzig. Gdansk is the old German city of Danzig, the old German port city of Danzig, which was part of what? The Hanseatic League. I don't think that's a coincidence, actually. I tend to think that history, forms in circles, and believe with Georgia Santayana that those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. And at 10:45 p.m., the 9th of November, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, which pretty much is the beginning of the current age of globalization that brought down the last physical barrier to trade. The rest of them are pretty much political, and we'll talk more about those. So the question that we have for you is that if we have all these varieties of capitalism, why aren't they becoming more similar, or are they? We're going to be spending a whole semester trying to answer those kinds of questions. We're largely going to focus our time on post-World War II, but in order to talk about this, I'm going to have to take you back in history for a number of the countries. What we're going to do now is a survey of some of the large industrial economies and talk about the development of their variety of capitalism, if you will, and why social structures, through what's called a path dependence approach, tend to be fairly rigid over time. I mean, the Japanese Kiretsu, which is a bunch of companies that formed around a central bank. Mitsui Bank and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries are closely related. There's similar things in Europe where Deutsche Bank owns significant portions of the large industrial companies there. South Korea, see the chaebols, and which are just largely industrial combines, all surrounded by a central bank. How did those things emerge, and why are they so important even today? The U.S. had different, methods of going towards some of those same goals. How did they deal with the idea of this free market capitalism, or this controlled market capitalism, or are there two basic forms out there? India's emergence from what's called the Permit Raj, China's transformation from communism to communist country with a capitalist economic system, which is an interesting transition. And of course, locally we need to look at the growth of the four tigers and see the similarities and differences there. So I think that's where I want to take you today. Well, I hope that you've got a sense for what we're going to be up to now, and thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.